Hey, OnScript listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Matt Lynch, coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I'm a host of OnScript along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, Amy Brown Hughes, and Jules Martinez Olivieri. In this rebroadcasted episode, Amy sits down with Sameer Yadav to talk about theology, race, and the mystical tradition. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. This is an episode I've gone back to a couple times and really appreciate it, and I thought you would as well. Or maybe this is your first time listening to it, so I hope you enjoy it and learn something new. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to onscript.study/donate to do so. We would really appreciate your support as we grow and develop, and we have a few new things in the works. And also, if you're not aware, we started another podcast this year called Biblical World, and that's a podcast that features discussions about the history, culture, archaeology, and geography of the Bible, so more like historical backgrounds of the Bible. And we've got some great episodes there, and you can go to onscript.study and click on the icon for Biblical World, the Biblical World podcast, and you can access all those episodes there. Just subscribe wherever you are. And we always appreciate any ratings you can give us for either podcast. That always helps people find what we're up to. And thanks so much for listening. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hello, friends. Welcome to OnScript. This is Amy Brown Hughes, a co-host for the podcast with Matt Lynch, Matt Bates, Aaron Heim, Drew Johnson, and Chris Tilling. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Sameer Yadav, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. I first came across Sameer because he wrote a really interesting section on Gregory of Nyssa in his now published dissertation, The Problem of Perception and the Experience of God Toward a Theological Empiricism, published by Fortress Press in 2015. I so appreciated his read of Gregory as a helpful theological companion for reframing religious experience that I looked into his more recent material on race and religion. At that point, I knew I wanted to talk to him. Sameer is a systematic theologian who works on the philosophy and theology of religious experience in the Christian mystical tradition, as well as theology and race and the theology and ethics of Christian scripture. I am delighted that he took time off of his research leave to talk with me today. And we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation, so buckle in, OnScript listeners. Like some symphonies, this podcast will come to you in 4 movements. We'll begin by discussing the discipline of systematic theology and the theological nature of religious experience, referencing his book, The Problem of Perception and the Experience of God Toward a Theological Empiricism. Then we'll move toward his hot off the presses or not yet on the presses work on a retrieval of apophaticism in the Christian mystical tradition, the intersection of theology, race, and the philosophy of religion, and finally drawing all these discussions together to think about where we go from here. Welcome, Sameer.
Thanks a lot for having me.
So, theology is a new terrain for OnScript listeners, not necessarily as a discipline, of course, but as a subject on the podcast. So I've been talking to each of my guests about the various disciplines within theology: constructive, practical, biblical, historical, and you are a systematic theologian. Could you start us off today by talking about what systematic theology is and what your journey into systematic theology looked like?
Yeah, so I can kind of give a sense of what systematic theology is by talking about its comparison to what philosophy is. So Wilfrid Sellars famously quipped that the aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. And you might think of Christian systematic theology as an articulation of the way Christians ought to understand how things hang together in the broadest sense of the term. So systematic theology is just an attempt to give a coherent account of Christian belief and practice that does justice to all the various sources of evidence. And so when it comes to sort of how I backed in to systematic theology, it was really just that it was indirect. I kind of backed into it. My parents immigrated from India in the early 70s, and I was raised Hindu, actually, and my identical twin brother and I have an identical twin brother, we both converted to Christianity as undergraduates. And I was a philosophy major. I found myself with a lot of questions about Christianity. It was very new to me, and it propelled me to seminary. And so I went to a really, really conservative seminary that didn't actually offer much of a theology education. Everything was Bible. And they were very serious about historical and grammatical exegesis of the biblical text. But I found myself, in that context drawn really to Hebrew, actually, in the study of the Old Testament. I continued my MDiv work to do a THM in Hebrew Bible, and I was really considering going on to ancient Near Eastern studies. My thesis was on the modal parameter in the classical Hebrew verbal system. So, wow. gripping stuff. And what led me to theology was just trying to figure out how to wrestle doctrinal norms out of my understanding of the biblical text. And I started asking hard questions about that, and it actually got me kicked out of seminary. I was at final draft thesis stage, and I got booted because I found myself questioning some of the cherished beliefs of the institution, like dispensationalism, the sign gifts and complementarianism about women's ordination. Those things were all worrying to me, and stuff like that. So in the course of getting pushed out, I found that my love of Hebrew grammar was in fact really kind of a love of discerning and interrogating something's inner logic and structure. I love structure. And so I started reading a lot of philosophical theology, post-liberal theology, and I eventually got into a conversation in contemporary theological study through post-liberalism. And I ended up writing a letter to Stanley Hauerwas. And he doesn't have email, so it was like a legit old school letter. And I told him my story and how I felt sort of dead-ended, and I sent him a paper I wrote, and he wrote me back. And we started a correspondence that went back and forth, and he ended up sort of helping me strategize how to apply to bridge degree programs, and I ended up at Yale through his advice doing an STM and working with Miroslav Volf and Dennis Turner and Serene Jones. And I applied to the newly minted THD program at Duke, and then I ended up going to study where Stanley was. So I kind of really circuitously found myself doing theology.
Oh, that's quite a story. And what I love about that is you have sort of baked into your story these intersections of disciplines, right, between systematics and other disciplines in theology. And I noticed this specifically in how you talked about race and theology, which we'll come back to. So can you talk a little bit, can you tease that out a little bit more about how you see these intersections? Because that really comes into play with philosophy of religion for you, biblical stuff.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so in my view, for Christians, systematic theology is just about trying to say what must be true, what has to be the case, or what might be true, what might be the case, if our story of creation and redemption is right. And trying to do that requires us to determine what kind of story we got to tell ourselves. How we describe who and what we are, and then to ask what that commits us to in every other domain of belief and practice. So it's for that reason that we're just trying to say what we are committing ourselves to by virtue of our story. It's for that reason that systematic theology is promiscuous. We find that whatever we propose to say commits us to a lot of things in philosophy and sociology and history, the sciences, and so on. And so working out with just what those commitments are, the strength of those commitments, and their relative importance to our confession, it just naturally propels us into other disciplines and helps us to make sense of ourselves and our picture of the world. And of course, what we find in the course of doing that also sometimes sends us back to our story, realizing that we need to tell it differently than we thought we had to tell it. And so to take, the well-worn example, we might discover falsely that we took our story to commit us to geocentrism. And we go, oh, crap, that's not right. So we got to fix that. And so we got to tell our story in such a way that it doesn't lead us to that. But that process of revision, rational revision, to understand simultaneously who and what we are and the way the world is something that cannot forego engagement with other forms of discourse and inquiry.
I like the theology is promiscuous phrase. That's nice. Or another, right, it's synthetic, right? It's a synthesis. It brings things together, things that don't necessarily go together. It's dialogical. It's mediatorial. And
that's a less dicey way of putting it.
But I think you're absolutely right. And it's also like ecclesia semper reformanda est, right? Like the church is always reforming, and theology is really the vehicle for that. Like otherwise we're just going to stand. And we got to get moving. We got to look at things. And methodologically, I mean, we see in history, as a historical theologian, I sort of have straddled the field of history, right? Where you do have what people have called revisionist history. And part of me just thinks, well, isn't that just the project of history? Like
exactly, right.
Like
as opposed to what?
If you get it wrong the first time, maybe you're just doing better history the second time.
Yeah.
So that's a good segue into a chapter that you have coming out in The Task of Dogmatics, edited by Oliver Crisp and Fred Sanders, and to be published by Zondervan. You talk about how there's no commonly accepted way that Christians theologians have told that story of creation and redemption that you just referred to. But the theologians of all stripes appeal to this story as constitutive in some way. So this situation you outlined provoked broad, but I think an important question with regard to theological method. How do we expand or perhaps even reframe our theology to be anchored in narrative? And of course, narrative, as a historical theologian, I'm like, yes, do the narrative. So the kind of creation, redemption narrative that we participate in, that we teach our kids, right? And that connects us with God and with one another, but that is also systematic and dogmatic in scope. How do we reframe our theology there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of possible ways in to talk about this, but so as we've kind of been discussing, I articulate the task of dogmatics as a kind of back and forth relationship of continuous examination of our story, what sorts of realities we take it to commit us to, recognizing and engaging, and doctrines as just formulations. What it is to formulate a doctrine is just to say what some Christian telling of a narrative of creation and redemption requires us to believe, or permits us to believe, or forbids us from believing, on pain of denying that story. So this way of putting things, I think one of the reasons it's helpful is because we often, I think, lean on the question, at least theologians tend to lean on the question of sources of theology. So what are the normative sources of theology? Scripture, tradition, experience, reason. I'm an Anglican, I'm Episcopalian, and so, we can talk about this way of understanding the sources versus some other Christian tradition's way versus Roman Catholics in the way that they understand their tradition as determinative versus the standard Protestant sola scriptura kind of thing, or whatever. And that focus on sources, I think, is a mistake as a way of kind of centering the question about what doctrines are and how they work, because those sources are instrumental. They're just a means for helping us figure out what to say about God's relation to the world and to ourselves and to each other. So the main center of gravity, I think, is on those stories, and then what they commit us to, and then that allows us, that starting point, that standpoint, and that framework allows us to then back up and say, okay, well, you tell your story this way, we tell our story this way. How do our sources guide that, and how can we maybe walk back into controversies about that rather than starting there and then going nowhere?
So one of the things that this comes up quite a bit in teaching, right, where theology is understood as an arena, where it's about conflict, it's about students feeling like, well, I have to believe the right thing about this before I can say anything. So they get all tongue-tied when somebody asks them a question, and they feel like they have to be on the offensive or on the defensive, right? Because it's a competition. There's even a bit of drama, to say the least. So when you talk about theology as grounded in narrative, as dogmatics, as being this back and forth, how might we begin to perhaps break down that assumption, where some of the common ways that we frame our boundary lines of theology, or if I can put it more directly, how can we more productively talk about orthodoxy and heresy?
Yeah, that's an important question, because I think often we think when we use terms orthodoxy and heresy, what we really mean is anyone who is to the left or the right of me and my enlightened friends is a heretic. And so it becomes a kind of indexical reference of self-congratulation rather than being principled in any way. And so I think orthodoxy and heresy really have two distinct kinds of meanings. And the first is actually the more determinative kind, and it's a way of describing the rational consensus of a group of knowledge seekers at any given stage of their tradition. So this is what you might call an epistemic conception of orthodoxy and heresy, because it's a matter of what a group of people at any given time have most reason to suppose must or might be true according to their shared narrative. So, for example, if a physicist today traveled back in time prior to the Einsteinian revolution in physics, and they decided to do business as usual on an Einsteinian paradigm when everybody else is, the consensus is a Newtonian paradigm, right? Then they would rightly be regarded as a heretic by the Newtonian community of physicists. That is, they would rightly be thought of as denying an orthodoxy about the way, medium-sized bodies or very small and very large bodies, how all that hangs together in terms of their dynamics. So I say but notice that was even if Einsteinianism is correct, they would still be regarded as a heretic. Rightly. I think rightly. Why? Because given the long and patient work of the tradition of inquiry represented by the Newtonian community, the burden of proof for changing the consensus is on the schismatic, is on the Einsteinian, right? And now, of course, a presumption of openness to inquiry on the part of the Newtonian community would lead maybe to a change in their consensus. And then what you would have, as we now do have, is an Einsteinian orthodoxy would develop, right? So orthodoxy in that sense is a moving target. Christian doctrinal development works that way, just the same kind of way. So, for example, after the Nicene orthodoxy emerged, it became rightly considered heretical to deny a doctrine of origins in thinking about the Trinity. What we mean by thinking about the persons has to be articulated in terms of relations of origin. Earlier ways of thinking about that represented, say, in the Apostles' Creed, that seems to suggest a doctrine of appropriations for the Trinity rather than a doctrine of origins. The touchiness of the heretical possibilities of a doctrine of appropriations become much more pronounced once the Nicene orthodoxy gets established, whereas prior to that it would have been perfectly orthodox to not be so insistent on relations of origin, right? Right.
And what's interesting is, the church kind of had to muddle through historically, right? Because it was sort of an I don't know if it's a written rule, I have to think about this, but of how to deal with people like prior to Nicaea. Like there was only one time with Origen of Alexandria later where the church posthumously declared someone a heretic prior to Nicaea, right? Which there's a lot of drama around that. Like that's
very controversial too, right? What is it about Origen that
and actually continues to be, right? Like this is the only time the church has ever done this. So judging people.
I'm pro-Origen, by the way, so yay, Origen.
I love him too. I've done my work on him. He's wonderful and delightfully spicy in all the right ways. I love him. So I think that there's something underneath here that helps us move away from the idea of theology as primarily propositional and statement-based.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that but it doesn't have to be. That is to say, you might think of it as propositionally based, but just think that, like I say, according to an epistemic use of orthodoxy and heresy, the relevant propositions are not static, not fixed. We can change them. They're subject to revision, and we can even have incorrect orthodoxies.
Absolutely, right? And so this leads me into my next question, and it's at the beginning of your book, where I always tell people, read the acknowledgments of a book, and yours were particularly delightful because you speak so beautifully about the different scholars in your story, which you mentioned a couple earlier, but Stanley Hauerwas, Paul Griffiths, Willie Jennings, Warren Smith, Sarah Coakley. And so I think this is a nice segue into thinking about theology as collaborative in that process of where correction does happen, where maybe seeing dynamism as opposed to something being static. How do you understand sort of that process of collaboration?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I got to say, thanks for reading the acknowledgments. That's actually, I tell people that was my favorite part of writing the book. That was the part of the book I'm proud of. The rest of it I'm just kind of nervously about, but that part was great. My theological interests, as you've rightly noticed, are deeply autobiographical. And the things I think and write about are things that keep me up at night. And that's a pretty common phenomenon in theology. It's not like, people who study physics or microbiology or something, and they're like, oh, protein binding is my passion, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, and it's I want to write poems about it. That's not really how that works. But in theology, it's largely so much about religious identity, and religious identity is so integral for our self-understanding that it makes collaboration in theology of a kind of intimacy, because we're sharing. It's not psychoanalytic, right? I'm not saying that what I'm writing about is not actually about the problem of the mind-world problem in perception, but actually about my feelings and my relationship with my dad or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the kind of work we're doing while giving arguments and blah 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 really is about something of deeply connected to the things that we think are important, that we care about, and that means our collaboration is an expression at the same time as it's a kind of putting forth an argument, it's an expression of ourselves, and the kind of cognitive intimacy that we develop with one another is something that I think we need to acknowledge and cherish. And we bring the rest of ourselves with our arguments, so who and what we are come along with our theological work, and that makes the ability to work with other people just such a gift in this discipline. Well,
it is, and I think that I try to explain this to students a lot, that when you see my book, don't see my book as me only, right? That this is a conversation with scholars. It's how I try to help them understand how to cite sources. I'm like, this is a conversation.
It's what I have to tell myself so that I actually write. I mean, I get paralysis in trying to write, and one of my advisors said to me that was really helpful is to say, look, think about your thought about any given subject topic as a moving stream, and when you write, you're just taking one snapshot of that stream as it's moving, and sort of throwing it down on paper. That doesn't commit you to saying that it's not going to move away or it has, it's going to go in a different direction. So you don't have to be so monomaniacally fixed on making sure everything you say is exactly what you are from henceforth committed to. It's rather just a way of capturing a flow. And I think you're right to say that it's important to communicate that to students and to readers.
So let's turn to your book for a little bit. In your book, The Problem of Perception and the Experience of God Toward a Theological Empiricism, and also in some of your more recent work, you ask some large questions about what it means to experience God. Could you talk about what led you down this path? I'm always curious about the trajectory of a research program. Was there initial bud that blossomed into something you didn't expect? Was it a slow process of connection between seemingly disparate questions?
Yeah, kind of all of those. Because there are a lot of different kinds of questions that converged for me on how to understand the nature of experience, our experience of God, and many of them were rooted in more social and political identity questions related to Christian confession. And that is to say that, as I mentioned to you before, it was post-liberalism that kind of drew me into theology in the first place. And I've since come to be kind of critical about some of that stuff or whatever. But what captured me about it was the notion of the church as a kind of contrast society, and a contrast society that is configured by its own discourse, its own language, its own inner logic, that is a matrix through which the world makes sense to us, and that fuels a distinctive form of practice. What we do, what we think, say, and do with one another is shaped by the distinctiveness of a Christian language, essentially. And that raised question, that got that kind of line, although powerful to me, received a lot of critique about, well, that's impenetrable from the outside. That's like a kind of hermetically sealed box that isn't subject to anything that would. It's like freestanding kind of, how might you put it, like a echo chamber, right? So where's the constraint so that we're not just sort of like, making stuff up and doing our own little pretend play game in a corner without any accountability to the way the world is and the way other people are and that kind of thing. So that was one direction. Another one was what Charles Taylor says in his Secular Age book, which is to say, he starts with the observation, look, 500 years ago, the idea that God exists, that the world is an observable theater of God's presence and action, that was simply a given. Nobody seriously questioned that idea. And the questions were really about, okay, so how do we understand the nature of that action, what happens in this theater, but not that's the way it works. And now, he says, even for believers, maybe especially for believers, the idea that God can become constituent in ordinary experience is very difficult for us. And so what changed? That's the question that frames his whole book. What changed? That made one thing seem natural, and now it's no longer natural to think of it, or second nature, so to speak, to think of it that way. And so that was another source of a problem for me. And he talks about that as what he calls the conditions of experience, or the background conditions of belief. And so I was having those questions in mind when I was at Yale Div doing my STM. And at the same time, I was taking courses in feminism, feminist theology, in mysticism with Dennis Turner, and reading modern theologians with like Kant and Schleiermacher, all of whom were very worried about the connection of religious belief to public sources of accountability, including experience. And so that kind of led me to problematize how a community's form of life might have to be understood in terms of some kind of proper sorting out of this dissonance that we have with how our form of life is held accountable by experience.
And I can hear in that a lot of your research that you have been doing since then, right? So connected to this, your research on perception is also your work on mysticism. So let's get into that a bit, because it's a really fun topic. Because I say mysticism, and some people have an allergic hives reaction to it, and other people ooh, give me all of the mysticism. So it's one or the other, right? Or other people, I don't know what. Let me back away slowly from this giant bear. So a definition of mysticism is notoriously difficult to nail down. But so let's give it a go. Let's see if we can solve it right now. What is mysticism?
What is it? It's tricky, as you notice, because the word mysticism, to designate any distinct tradition of belief and practice in Christianity, it doesn't even appear until the 18th century. So, some scholars like to point that out as a way of showing, look, there's no such tradition of belief and practice as a Christian mysticism. It's an invention of the 18th century fascination with certain aspects of religion that they then project backwards onto the Christian tradition. And so certain people end up getting slotted as mystics who would never have called themselves mystics, doing mystical theology in which they would have never thought of themselves as doing that, and that sort of thing. So that's difficult, right, to navigate. But I actually think that conclusion is the wrong conclusion to draw. I follow Bernard McGinn, who has done lifelong magisterial studies on Christian mystics and their theology. And on his definition, which is one that I accept, it's that mysticism is a continuous tradition of belief and practice that's oriented by what he describes as the preparation for, the attainment of, and the response to, the effects of, a direct or immediate consciousness of the presence of God. That's how he understands the mystical element in Christianity that you can trace through. And I would add to McGinn something that Amy Hollywood observes in her kind of description of Christian mysticism. It's that the kind of consciousness McGinn describes, of the direct or immediate presence of God, is ordered by 4 particular kinds of axes: transcendence and immanence, time and eternity, the sayable and the unsayable, and individual and community. So those different kinds of poles come to shape and order the way that mystics theorize and reflect on the nature of the direct or immediate consciousness of God in their work. So that's how I would get the McGinn-Hollywood thesis of how to define
Nice. I like that
mysticism.
you sort of were like, let me draw from these other people. So
Yeah. Back up.
When you do talk about mysticism, you draw on Gregory of Nyssa, a favorite of mine, and Pseudo-Dionysius, to talk about how the mystic is required to make an ascent in her experience of God's presence. Can you explain the language of ascent? I know for many Protestants, this language may be unfamiliar and slightly, get the eyebrow raise. So can you explain that?
Yeah. And there's lots of Christian theologians who we think of as architects of various features of Christian orthodoxy talk about the ascent. Gregory of Nyssa, as you mentioned, but then there's a whole tradition from him, and a lot of theologians think of the ascent differently in different terms. And the image comes from Moses in ascending Mount Sinai to meet with God. And the idea is just, the basic idea is that there's just a process by which we come to encounter God and be transformed by God in our own lives. And that process has an inner logic to it that you can discern. And if you had to break it down, there's lots of possible ways to do it, but one of the most predominant is to say that the ascent involves a kind of purgation, a kind of dealing with the aspects of one's being that prevent one from seeing properly, having the purity of heart to see God, to put it in the Beatitudes kind of way. And then that purgation of one's soul leads to a kind of illumination, a kind of where God, by grace, shows us God's self in some way. And that process of purgation and illumination leads to a kind of encounter with God at a pinnacle of experience that is variously described by mystics in terms of a kind of union with God, a kind of union of the soul with God. And exactly how to give a correct theology of the ascent is like any piece of theology is a source of debate among mystics, but that's the basic idea behind it.
Yeah, and And I think there's a sense here, immediately I was thinking about this process, right? And like, I think there's been just some issue, especially in maybe Protestant evangelicalism, of not quite knowing, like understanding that there needs to be a purgative process, that there is some kind of procession, and when we have all these things, right? Okay, justification, conversions in there somewhere, sanctification's in there somewhere, and then we have like Pilgrim's Progress, right? Where it's this progression, but it's like, is he like he's not a Christian? Is he like, when does he actually become one? Like, when does when does this actually happen? So we have that there, but I think that there's a sense of not quite knowing, and then you have on the Eastern Orthodox side, you have like theosis, where you have such a sort of big soup where all of that stuff is just dumped into one big pile, right? And like, that there's a progression there, but it can be very sort of circuitous, and there's a lot of development there. But there is this piece potentially with with the Ascent, and of like this purgation, this transformation of maturity that feels like it can be something where only Moses gets to do that, of only some people being able to get there, as it were. I don't have time to spend an hour with God every day, or, I can't read everything I get. Like, so can you address that concern?
Yeah. I mean, one way to address it is to say that it's predicated on a mistake. And I mean that to say that this, as you're, I think, right to say, prevalent notion in a lot of Protestant evangelicalism, that the ground is level at the foot of the cross, and therefore, there's whatever is good and right and redemptive about the Christian life has to not only be achievable by all, but has to be sort of equally distributed among all. And that just simply doesn't follow. I mean, that is to say that there's a kind of contradiction, an inner contradiction, on the one hand, regarding the process of spiritual maturation as involving skill, and that skill being given by grace, but still requiring one's participation in cultivation of it. The Pauline work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because it's God who wills and works in you. The idea that you have to do something that requires that's difficult. Well, that idea just predicts that some people are going to have greater cultivation than others, and this is clearly displayed in the New Testament, in Paul's admonition to follow him as he follows Christ, in spiritual discourse about the difference between milk and meat for those who receive spiritual food, and so on. So the idea that we each have capacities that we are responsible to exercise, and that we must look to other exemplars in exercising, is something I think that we ought not shy away from the consequences of that. Elitism, what elitism is simply a misuse of power on the basis of that fact. So it's not the fact itself, not the fact that there are different speeds, different maturities. It's the misuse of that and an asymmetric use of power. That's what's wrong with elitism.
Which is a great segue, another one, into our third movement here. You're also working on an intersection of theology and race and the philosophy of religion, in your spare time. So thank you for sending me a draft of a chapter on this. I also know you're working on a book and about this, so I want to spend some time digging into your work here. You argue that theorizing the race-religion intersection is a necessarily philosophical task, and not just the purview of sociologists and historians, for example. Can you give us the pitch as to why the framework you propose is needed, and then follow that up with an overview of that framework?
Okay, sure. So one way to put this is to say that a large number of sociologists and historians and theologians who draw on them work on the formation of racial categories and meanings in the Western world. And a lot of that sociology and history has long recognized that there's this role of Western Christianity that was played in developing and rationalizing race thinking, and particularly racist race thinking. And it was European Christians who came to understand themselves as white in the process of identifying other peoples as various sorts of non-white, and who organized their understanding of self and other into a hierarchical color system and all of that. But the question is whether Christian theology, a Christian story, and an attempt to work out its implications, whether that was a cart or a horse in constructing the modern racial system. So Taylor seems to, like Paul Taylor, who's a philosopher who draws a lot on this sociology and history, and does philosophy of race, he seems to follow a lot of others in regarding political and economic forces to be the horse and the engine that drove the development of race thinking, while Christian theology was just in one episode in which it was a cart pulled along by that horse for a brief time. And it was a convenient source of cultural authority to reinforce a basically political and economic racial regime. And it was a form of authority that was eventually replaced by the rise of modern science, which became the new patsy for propping up racial reasoning. And I follow a lot of others, historians and so on, and increasingly theologians, in thinking that what this misses is the role of theology as an engine, as a driver of race thinking that was at its inception and that contributed to an inner logic or structure that continued well beyond the rise and fall of Christendom, and still works in contemporary race thinking. And so there are a lot of people who theologians who are starting to work on that, but they tend to neglect a lot of work in the philosophy of race that goes beyond merely giving a historical reconstruction of where race came from and how it was developed, to actually ask questions about what race is as a sort of question of metaphysics. What is racial identity? And what is social identity more generally? What is it to belong to a social group more generally? Those kind of questions, I think, haven't been always handled the best in the theological literature. And so that's the work I'm trying to bring in.
Yeah, when I read this, I thought, wow, this is a really important connectivity piece. Not only do you outline the need, because you do outline Paul Taylor's narrative, and then you go into, which was quite intense to just read, to say the least. I might have you just give a brief overview of this genealogical accounting of race formation, and how this connecting this with religion and it not being this kind of additional thing. But another way of saying this is we really have to come to terms potentially with the complicity of theology, right? And not just recently, but like for a long time. So would you, you mentioned very briefly what is missing in these. So maybe I'll ask now, maybe to flesh out, you say that there's a need for a useful diagnostic tool of sorts to look at our past and present and consider what needs to be destroyed and what needs to be reconstructed in the formation of Christian identity. And I'll just quote from your article here. You say this, quote, "A religious racial formation theory proposes minimally that there are features of Christian group identity that form the anchors of contemporary racial group identity, initially fixing its identity, membership, and persistence conditions, including its various racist conditions of hierarchy, dehumanization, and asymmetric distribution of social and political goods. It therefore raises the question of what sort of diagnosis and amelioration of racism might be required in our making and remaking of the race-religion intersection." Now, there's a lot going on there, but it's basically the question that I framed just a moment ago. Like, what has to be, like, sort of a principled iconoclasm here? Like, what needs to be destroyed? What needs to be reconstructed, and what do we do about this? How do we move forward there?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and it's one that is receiving a lot of important work from a lot of different people right now. I think, in my view, chief among which is Willie Jennings' stuff. So, if this were if Christianity were fundamentally racist per se, then I wouldn't be a Christian. But maybe the Western Christian tradition is fundamentally racist, and maybe it requires, therefore, a deep and theological and practical reform. And I think a central site for that reform is not actually centrally located in theological anthropology, which centers on racist deformations in the way we think about what it is to be made in the image of God, or how Christ exemplifies the image of God, so that, for example, the image, the imago, comes to resemble the white sovereign subject in the Western Christian social imagination. There's important critique to be had there, but I think a more fundamental site of reform that grounds the image and Christology stuff is a doctrine of peoplehood, or ecclesiology. What is it to be a people? How do Christians imagine the existence and relationships of peoples? Christians are committed to a kind of ontology, a social ontology, a way of identifying what kinds of social groups they are, according to which there are at least three social groups that are natural, or that by natural I mean that they're not merely human artifacts, but they are sort of created by God and have identity and persistence conditions that can't be altered by us. And those are, or at least on one way of thinking about peoplehood. And the question is whether we ought to revise that conception or not. But that those peoples are Jews, Gentiles, and Christians, right? And then later pagans, which is a kind of complicated thing we could talk about. But Christians therefore believe that there are such things as interhuman kinds of people. And how Christian salvation comes to be articulated depends on a certain model of identifying what it is to be a people, to belong to any of those groups, and what joining of peoples together has to look like. And that is basically the site, that ecclesiological piece is what goes wrong, according to what Willie Jennings sort of masterfully discusses in his book, The Christian Imagination. I think a framing of a diagnosis needs more attention to what I call in the paper a Christian social ontology, a theological account of what peoples are and what sort of people Israel was and is, and so on. So that's some of the work that I'm trying to do, and trying to intervene on some of the debates about supersessionism that get raised by that, and to discipline some of those debates by some relevant philosophical discourse on peoplehood.
Yeah, I found this your article would be really, really helpful because, well, partially as a theologian, right? Because I love synthesis and being able to see that, you really put some words to things that I have seen, because theological anthropology is one thing that I teach and something that I'm very interested in and do some work on. And I found this to be so helpful because I to get underneath some of this stuff and specifically in our own tradition, to look at our own house here. How have we talked about this? And I know as an early Christian theologian, the conversations between Jews and Christians, right? We have a long history of saying some very terrible things about Jews. And so it begs the question of how we navigated those engagements with different peoples and perhaps what were some of the things that became baked into the way we do theology that may need to be not just revisited, but even potentially restructured, but not in the sense of how God has revealed God's self to us, but in the way that we, because of our own contextualization, have made some choices.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that it also, that's a really nice way of highlighting that this is rational revision might have practical constraints. That is to say, it literally may not be possible to revise the way we think about what peoples are and how they properly relate together in a story of redemption, apart from certain kinds of practice, apart from attempting to revise what we think, say, and do, in fact, in our relationships to one another. And so that's an important thing to see how not just a theological synthesis, and this is like a key feature of any liberation theology, which is to say liberative practice is a constraint on liberative theology.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm going to do a hard turn here because we're having a very, this is really important stuff, but I want to move into a bit of our speed round. So hard turn. But so here we go. Just your immediate responses. Are you ready?
Okay, hit me.
What is the weirdest thing you've ever eaten?
Weirdest thing I've ever eaten. Oh gosh, it depends on. You can't ask theologians this stuff. It's like, what in the world? Weird is a norm that is culturally determined, and therefore, what is weird to you, and etc. and so forth. But gosh, what have I? I think I might have eaten some manner of testicle. I don't know. And kind of manner of animal testicle. Rocky Mountain oyster, maybe.
Are you a morning or night person?
Oh my goodness, night person.
I don't understand nocturnal people.
I wish I were. I always wish it.
I turn
likewise, my friends.
9:30,
Likewise.
I can't do anything anymore. But you get me up at 4:30 a.m. and I'm like, woohoo, let's do it. In the past 50 years of theology, what is the most off-the-wall theory you've heard advanced by theologians?
Whoa. Okay. Last 50 years. Let's see. I think that among the more disturbing kind is the theonomist, who think that you got to reconstruct sort of reconstruct out of particularly American society a distinctively kind of Israelite law code society. So it's like supersessionism to the max.
Yikes.
You know?
That will be definitely filed in the off-the-wall category. Teleportation or flying?
Teleportation, without a doubt.
I agree. If you could bring back any fashion trend, what would it be?
Let's say... Now, does it have to be an American fashion trend?
No.
Oh, okay. Then I would love Nehru hats. The Jawaharlal Nehru, those, and the outfit, the suits.
Oh, yeah.
I love those things. Those things are awesome.
You just caused a bunch of people to Google something on their phone.
Yes.
Nehru
outfits.
Do it.
Yeah.
What's the most significant book in theology in the last 50 years, from your perspective?
Mine. Just kidding.
I love the quick on the draw there. You're like, absolutely mine.
Only because it's facetious. The most important in the last 50 years? Mm-hmm. Gosh,
or significant.
I gotta say, it's Willie's book, The Christian Imagination. I just think it's an amazing book. I was a research assistant on that book when I was at Duke, and just I would. That's probably what it would be.
That would be in some of the top books I would choose as well.
Yeah.
So, what is your favorite magical or mythological animal?
Mythological animal. I like the griffin. Griffin's pretty great.
Nice.
Lots of different things going on there.
Yeah. What is one idea in theology you think needs to die?
One idea in theology that needs to die. The idea that... okay. Gosh, I have so many pet peeves, so it's hard to know what to pick. But I hate when people draw on McIntyre to suggest that that tradition is unrevisable. Essentially, they use it as a protective strategy to avoid engagement with alternative traditions, right? So it ends up being McIntyre as a kind of excuse to lock things down and to turn towards the center of one's identity rather than outward. I hate that stuff.
Yeah. Okay, one more. You have your own late night talk show. Who would you invite as your first guest?
And it could be
anyone.
anybody?
Living, dead, doesn't matter.
Oh gosh. That's tough. I actually would love to. I would love to have Stephen Colbert.
Ooh.
I would love to be able to talk to him about politics and religion and all kinds of stuff, and it would just be really fun because I love the banter. So that would be great.
Oh, yeah. So just a couple more questions, and sort of bringing this to some payoff here. So our final movement in our on-script symphony of today. To help us connect theory with practice, how does these large ideas of theology as narrative, like a meta dogmatic theory, as you call it, these talking about mysticism and this theory of race, religion intersection, how does this move us forward as a church? So let's talk about those specifically. Let's start with the big sort of story narrative of theology. How does this help us move forward as a church?
So my upbringing, I kind of may have mentioned, really strongly imprinted on me. My upbringing, that is to say, my parents are immigrants. I grew up in an immigrant kind of household in rural Idaho, which I tell people sounds like the basis of a sitcom, Hindu in Idaho. And what it really imprinted on me was the problem of incongruous cohabitation. How do we find our common identity in a story that we all tell so differently? How do we think and act faithfully toward a God we don't and can't really understand? How do we share life and identity with those who are unlike us? All of these questions, whether it's about the scripture stuff or the race stuff or the mysticism stuff, they're for me about the necessity of insisting on bringing together things and people that don't seem to belong together. And that thought is a deeply Christian thought about how God relates to the world and how we mirror that relation with one another. The life of the church is a projection of this kind of incongruous cohabitation. It's a scandalizing of proper boundaries in who and what can be together and live together. An incomprehensible God, infinite, perfect God with things like us who are finite and limited, and a people who define ourselves by limited vision, and constrained in all kinds of material ways, constraints that we place on ourselves, and that we still have to find a way to live together and to be convinced that life together can be imaging of God's own perfect life, not despite the incongruities, but in virtue of them.
Yeah. That's really well put. I think you've highlighted a couple times there's the nature of human finitude, right? Like, I think sometimes when we talk about like church unity, the idea is that, or even talking about theology, like large or anything that's an umbrella idea, that we think that the way that that's best articulated or seen is if we're just everyone's all in one big room. Right? And then unless we're all in one big room, then we can't actually ever get anything done. Which I get the one big room idea. We see this with in eschatology, right? This image of the wedding supper and all nations, all peoples. But before that, we're humans that don't have the ability to constantly be in the same room as lots of different people all the time and different ideas, depending on access, mobility, just geographical location, language. So I think there's something in there, something beautiful about human finitude.
Yeah, it reminds me of about being a family. I mean, there's a connection between being together and insisting on letting each other be. And when kids grow up and move out of the house and siblings all continue to bear relations to one another. They tried to recognize, no matter where, time, and place they bear a deep and important connection to one another and an openness to one another that is given, against the background of knowing that one another's lives are one another's lives, and you got to let each other be in a certain kind of way. And I think that one way of putting the big room problem that you talk about is a way of refusing to let one another be in the name of being together. So,
sort of this collapsing of distinction, collapsing of letting people sort of inhabit the space that they have, right? That somehow Christianity has room for everyone, and that they don't need to be minimized in order to do that. And then there's something about us being as a whole, like where 2 or 3 or more of you are gathered, there I am with you also. There's just something wonderful about that.
Yeah, it's Catholicity. It's the doctrine of Christian Catholicity. Mm-hmm. And that's what, in a lot of ways, when I talk about the ecclesiological problem, it's a problem of Catholicity. How to theorize it and how to live it.
What a delight it is to talk to you, Sameer. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thank you.
This is your host, Amy Hughes with OnScript. We've been enjoying a conversation today with Sameer Yadav, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Westmont College. He has written The Problem of Perception and the Experience of God Toward a Theological Empiricism, published with Fortress Press in 2015. In addition to diving into this book, you can find a link on our website, onscript.study. Be on the lookout for his forthcoming works on mystical theology and the theology of race and religion intersection. Thank you for joining me today, friends.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.